60, Sassy and Sleuthing. Colt Calling Rescue Horse Mysteries Prequel, written by Morgana Best, narrated by Amy Soaks. Chapter 1. I don't know what woke me, maybe the storm, but with a jolt I was wide awake. I was relieved I was in my own bed and hadn't awoken in the barn after another bout of sleepwalking. A glance at my phone showed me it was a little past 5 in the morning. The sense of trepidation settled heavily on me. I jumped out of bed and pulled on some jeans, 2 mismatched thick socks, a bra and a blouse, careful not to wake my housemate, whose bedroom was at the other end of the house. I always knew when something was wrong with one of the horses. I didn't know whether it was a sixth sense or some sort of innate psychic ability, but every time I had a churning feeling in my stomach, something bad invariably happened. I hurried down the steep stairs to the kitchen and pulled on my boots, sitting in the walk-in pantry. Sure, it was a funny place for boots, but it was an old house, and the pantry doubled as a mudroom of sorts. I grabbed my torch and hurried outside. I wasn't outside for long before I turned around and ran back inside for a coat. The driving rain was cold and relentless. I presently headed for the paddocks, shining my light over the horses. The mares in the closest paddock stared at me sleepily. I spun around to the side paddock. Billy the Kid, an ex-racehorse, was missing. I had rescued Billy from becoming dog meat, but Billy repaid me for saving his life by breaking through the electric fences at the first crack of thunder and trotting across town to visit his girlfriends. Yes, Billy the Kid had multiple girlfriends. There was Starburst, the horse my neighbor bought for her granddaughter, and Fancy, the horse the postman bought to bribe his son into at least pretending to do his homework. Billy's was a small paddock, and there was nowhere he could hide. That was when I noticed the escape route. A tree branch had fallen on the fence. Those white gums dropped their branches so easily. I thought I had heard lightning strike something close by the previous night. I went around to the back of the house to turn off the electric fence, grabbed a halter and lead from the tack room, and took off at a jog towards the fallen tree. Billy's paddock backed directly onto bushland. That horse could be anywhere by now. Something was wrong, something more than the missing horse. I quickened my pace. I didn't like the bushland around the creek. None of the locals did. Legends told of bunyips, fearful creatures of Aboriginal folklore living in that creek. In the relentless mud, I could see a large hoof print here and there leading down to the creek. I spotted Billy grazing on the other side of the creek, his once grey coat now brown from dirt. Relief flooded me. A second later, my foot caught in a tree root, forcing me down hard into the mud. I picked myself up, shaken. My right arm had taken my full weight, and my shoulder was jarred. The creek here was wide. I certainly didn't want to swim over to the other side. At least Billy the Kid was standing there, grazing, and not trotting away. I knew the river narrowed further down. I was already drenched, covered in mud, and the rain wasn't easing. I had no choice but to continue to the narrow part of the river. I hoped the horse would stay where he was. It took me 15 minutes to reach Billy the Kid, and thankfully he allowed himself to be caught. "You've had quite the adventure, haven't you?" I said, stroking his long mane. I turned around and led him straight back down to the river where the track was stony and better underfoot. The sight before me brought me to a sudden stop. There, lying on the riverbank, was a woman, and I was fairly certain she was dead. Chapter 2. I was sitting in my kitchen, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. My housemate, Harriet, had made me the coffee while I was having a shower. Her hair, too, was soaking wet. Billy the Kid was in a stable until I could fix his fence, and I had called in 2 of my regular volunteers to feed the horses their breakfast. I had already shown 2 uniformed police officers the body. The paramedics had called the police and had asked me to wait to speak to them. By the time I had reached home with Billy the kid, I was exhausted, cold, and stressed. "Have some oats," Harriet urged for at least the 5th time. "You'll feel better if you eat something." I shook my head. "I can't. It was horrible." I clamped my hands over my eyes. "I need to fix Billy the kid's fence, but the police said I have to speak to the detectives." Harriet nodded slowly. I expected I had already told her that a dozen times. "Monica and Becky should be able to fix that fence together." I sighed with relief. Of course they can. It's only a white gum branch, not a whole tree. If they can get the branch off the fence and replace the wire, fix the electric tape, and then turn the electric fence back on, that would be great. I have to wait for the detectives. I paused to draw breath. "I didn't know detectives were called to drowning victims," Harriet said. I shrugged. "It might be standard procedure in all cases of drowning." Harriet looked out the window. "Well, that's a fancy black car." "The plumber has a black car?" "Not a fancy one like this. And the plumber came while you were away, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to have that shower. He only just left. You would have passed him on the way in." Silly me, of course. I stood up and watched as a black Mustang made its way up my driveway. I hope they shut the front gate. Maybe it's somebody coming to make a large donation, I said hopefully. The government didn't fund private animal rescue shelters in Australia. We had to rely on donations from the public. My hopes were dashed when a man got out of the passenger seat and introduced himself as Detective Tim Smith. "I'm looking for Cally Colt." I nodded. "That's me." His eyebrows shot skyward. "Sorry, I'm actually looking for the person who runs this establishment. Surely a younger person. With all these big horses and everything, I mean. Are you her grandmother and you share the same name?" He looked me up and down. The driver pushed past him. "That's enough, Smith." To me, he said, "I'm Detective Rick Bronco." Rick Bronco was tall. I considered myself tall, but he towered over me. He had black hair, greying at the sides, black eyes, and was a solid 10. I hadn't seen him or his car in town before. I would have noticed. He narrowed his eyes. "I am new in town," he said, confirming my thoughts. "I'd like to ask you some questions. I assume you are Cally Colt?" I nodded. "Everybody calls me Cally. Please come inside." He stared at Harriet. "And you are?" "I'm Harriet Hamilton, Cally's housemate. We've been friends since we were kids. I recently broke up with my husband, and Cally said I could stay with her until I get on my feet." The detective folded his arms over his chest. "I was simply expecting your name, not your life history. You may go. I wish to speak to Ms. Colt alone." Harriet raised her eyebrows at me and then left the room. I had no doubt she would listen in on the conversation. I bit back a smile. The 2 detectives sat at the large round table in my kitchen. I sat as far away from Detective Bronco as possible and clutched my coffee cup. "Name, age, and address for the record," he snapped. As soon as I told him, he added, "Did you know the victim?" I shook my head. "No, I've never seen her before. Not that I got a good look." I shuddered. "Was she new to town?" I thought his question strange, since I had already told him I didn't know her. "How would I know?" He pursed his lips. "How did she die?" I shrugged. "I assume she drowned, didn't she?" He did not respond, but rocked back in the chair and locked his hands behind his head. "Come on now, Ms. Colt. Are you trying to tell me this was an accidental drowning?" I was perplexed. "I'm not trying to tell you anything. One of the horses got out. I went looking for him, and I found her body. That's all I know." I ended on a firm note. He moved forward quickly, the front 2 legs of his chair landing with a thud. "The victim was murdered." "Murdered?" I squeaked. "Are you sure?" The other detective spoke for the first time in what was rapidly turning into an interrogation. "We won't know until—" he began, but Detective Bronco interrupted him. "I will continue questioning Miss Colt, and would you ask those women we saw outside if they knew the victim, and question the woman who just left the room?" The other detective looked displeased, but scurried away. Detective Bronco clasped his hands. "Now we can speak freely. I have just moved to this town, and I'm not going to take any nonsense. There will be no more of these murders on my watch, of that I can assure you. I don't approve of the old ways, and I will prosecute anybody who thinks those ways are acceptable." I was thoroughly confused. Had I hit my head and suffered a concussion? I didn't think so. Had Harriet slipped some brandy into my coffee? I gingerly sipped it, but no, it tasted normal. "I don't have a clue what you're talking about," I told him. "You're not making any sense." The detective stared at me in disbelief. "How can you pretend you don't know what I'm talking about? After all, your family is famous. I investigated people like you in this town before I arrived, but I had already heard of your family before that. Are you trying to tell me you can't do what your ancestors can do?" "I have no idea what you mean. If you mean competing in show-jumping events, well, no, I was always too afraid to jump, if you must know." I allowed myself a small moment of shame. My parents had always been disappointed that I, their only child, didn't follow in their footsteps. They kept a stable of A-grade show-jumpers. "You're from the famous bloodline, so you can see why I'm suspicious of you." My anger was slowly replacing my fear. "My family were famous show-jumpers," I said. "What does that have to do with the woman who was drowned? This is ridiculous. It wasn't as if she was drowned in a water jump. Drowning and show-jumping have nothing to do with each other." I saw, or perhaps imagined I saw, a small flicker of confusion flit across his face before the immovable mask came down once more. "The woman was drowned, Miss Colt, and you must realize what that means. You can see why I suspect you." I was beyond exasperated. "No, I only found the body," I said. "Do I need a lawyer?" "Do you think you need a lawyer?" One of the volunteers burst through the door. "Greta Garbo got out of her paddock. I wasn't fast enough shutting the gate and she slipped past me." I jumped to my feet, but the detective barred my way. "Surely that can wait." I moved around him. "Greta Garbo was surrendered by a film company. She was a failed stunt fall horse. Failed because she deliberately sits on any person in reach. We can never rehome her." I ran out the door to see Greta Garbo sitting on Detective Smith's legs. His language made my ears burn. I turned to the volunteer. "Fetch some carrots." "To lure Greta Garbo off him?" "No, as a reward." Chapter 3. The detective had left me thoroughly shaken. My two regular volunteers, Monica and Becky, had fixed the fence and now were sitting at the kitchen table with me. I told them everything the detective had said. "He sounds quite mean," Harriet said. "He is awfully good-looking, though, don't you think, Cally?" "I hadn't noticed," I lied. "Besides, his personality outweighs his looks, and what's with that sporty black car?" "He's too old for a car like that." Becky scrunched up her nose. Sorry, Cally, he's about your age, I'd guess. And yours too, Harriet." Harriet and I exchanged glances. "That's okay. Everybody under 20 thinks people my age are ancient relics," I said. "I'm not as old as Miss Marple, though." Harriet's eyebrows shot skyward. "Miss Marple? I don't understand the connection." "Why, sleuthing, of course. I'll have to be a veritable Miss Marple to solve this crime." "Are you mad?" Harriet shook her head vigorously. "With a murderer on the loose, you can't investigate. It's way too dangerous. I'm sure that the detective is competent." "Not if he suspects me," I pointed out. Harriet appeared to be thinking it over. "Okay, then. The murderer must be somebody new to town. I was about to ask why when she pushed on. If there was already a murderer living in town, we'd know about it. Monica batted her oversized false eyelashes. No, we wouldn't. A murderer always has to start somewhere. Maybe it's a serial killer and this was the first victim. I walked to the kitchen sink and rinsed my cup. There have been lots of cases of drowning in town over the years. I looked out of the window and munched on a carrot. The fence was nicely repaired, and Billy the Kid was happily eating his hay. Harriet cleared away the plates. They're all accidents. Her tone was firm. I shrugged. Are they? Everybody would have thought this one was an accident too, if it wasn't for Detective Bronco. Harriet nodded slowly. That's true. I walked back over to the table. The first thing we have to do is to find out the victim's identity. Monica agreed. Then we find out the victim's enemies. Harriet, wasn't that your phone? Harriet looked absently at her phone, lying on top of a bridle. She picked it up and then let out a squeal. My ex-husband texted me. Don't be upset, I began, but Harriet let out another scream. That woman who was murdered! It was Jane Fairweather, his mistress. He left me for her. Harriet slumped into a chair. The police will suspect me now. She burst into a flood of tears. Chapter 4. I was even more keen to investigate, now that my best friend was also likely a police suspect. My number one suspect was, quite reasonably I thought, Harriet's ex-husband, Joel. Maybe Joel and his mistress had a falling out. Maybe she had been fooling around with another married man. I needed to ask questions of somebody who knew Jane Fairweather. I decided to go to the local cafe and grab a coffee. I was only going there on a fact-finding mission, so I planned to get a decaf. I was all caffeined out and hyped up. I didn't even have a chance to get in my car before another vehicle drove in and parked directly behind me. A thin woman jumped out of the car. I recognized her as Audrey, one of the local racehorse trainers. You simply must rescue this horse, she said. What horse? I asked, followed by, but we're full. I don't have room or finances for another horse. Audrey shook her head. A really nasty man owns her, and he's going to get rid of her, if you know what I mean. She made a slitting motion across her throat. She's an ex-racehorse. He used to race her back in the day. He kept her on his cattle farm when she retired, but he doesn't want to feed her in the drought, so she has to go. I groaned. And I suppose she's awfully thin? Audrey clicked her tongue. I'm afraid so. Please take her, Cally. She's 21 years old. 21? I repeated. That's getting on for an ex-racehorse. I'll never be able to rehome her. Another horse I can't rehome, I thought, and the expenses are mounting. Aloud, I said, Has he agreed to surrender her? Audrey smiled and nodded. Yes, and I can collect her for you, if you like. He has to sign the surrender papers. Give them to me, and I'll make sure he does. Hang on a moment. I ran back through the kitchen door, through the living room and into my office, snatched the surrender papers, which I always kept on top of the filing cabinet, and sprinted back out to Audrey. I thrust the papers at her. You wouldn't happen to know a woman by the name of Jane Fairweather? Audrey frowned. No, why? I didn't want to get into the whole business of the drowning victim and me finding the body, so I simply said, Gotta go, I'm in a rush. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for bringing the mare here. No worries, Audrey shot me a smile. I'll make a donation to help with her rehabilitation. Thanks. I jumped in my car and waved through the window. The cafe was only 5 minutes away. The cafe, a hotbed of local gossip, was run by a husband and wife team, and although on appearances they seemed the least likely to gossip, They knew everything that happened in town. I was thankful I was the only person in the cafe when I arrived. I ordered first, and then asked the couple if they knew of a Jane Fairweather. Unsurprisingly, the woman did. "Yes, she drowned this morning. You found the body, didn't you?" I nodded. "It was horrible. One of the horses got out because a branch fell on his fence. He ran off into the bushland out the back." "There's damage all over town," she said. "Our power was out for an hour this morning. Of course, we're on a different power grid here to your side of town." She continued to talk about the strangeness of having two different power grids in the one small town. When she stopped to draw breath, I said, "I didn't know the victim. Have you ever heard of her before?" She nodded. "Yes, so sad, isn't it? She used to come in here and get coffee after her riding lessons." I pricked up my ears. She had riding lessons? Locally? There was only one place in town that gave riding lessons. "Yes, dressage lessons from Margaret Wells, but that's all I know." I took a sip and then realized I had forgotten to ask for a decaf. I shrugged and drank it anyway. By the time I got to the riding school, I was horribly over-caffeinated. I couldn't see anybody out with the horses, so I walked over to the house and knocked. Margaret, the proprietor of the riding school, came to the door. "Cally," she said in surprise, "are you trying to rehome a rescue horse to one of my clients again?" I chuckled. "No, I wish. I don't have anything suitable at the moment." I decided to come straight to the point. "I was the one who found Jane Fairweather's body this morning." Margaret's mouth fell open. "How dreadful. Come and talk with me on my way to see my new warm blood. I was just heading out the door to see how he's settling in." She handed me an umbrella. She named the establishment she had bought him from, and I gasped. "He must have cost you a fortune." "He did." Margaret pulled a face. "Don't tell Guy, will you?" She chuckled, and then her face changed. "A terrible business about Jane. The detectives came to see me this morning." Her hand went to her throat. "They said she was murdered." "Yes, and I think the detectives suspect me because I found her body." "I didn't know you knew her." I held up my hands, palms upwards. "I didn't. But to be honest, that's why I came to see you. I thought I had better do some sleuthing. Did she have any enemies?" Margaret shook her head. "Not as far as I know. I didn't know her all that well. I'd only been giving her dressage lessons for a couple of months. She seemed nice enough, but a bit scatterbrained. She wasn't a very good rider. That's why I sent her off to ride Buttercup this morning." We had reached the stables, and Margaret proudly showed me her new warm blood. He put his ears flat back at me, and I instinctively took a step backwards. "He doesn't have a very good temperament," Margaret said ruefully. I made several polite comments about how nice-looking the horse was, before something occurred to me. "Hang on a moment. Did Jane Fairweather go riding this morning? It must have been awfully early." "Yes, I was up at 5 because I was expecting the horse transport early." She gestured to her new horse. "He was over an hour late, and Jane arrived just as he did. Jane had a standard booking here twice a week for a lesson at 6:30 in the morning, but this morning I told her she could take Buttercup out for a trail ride instead, and I wouldn't charge her. Buttercup is nice and safe, you see. She usually rides Bordeaux, but he's not safe for non-experienced riders to ride outside of the manege." "You mean Buttercup, that quiet quarter horse you've had for ages?" Margaret nodded. "That's right, and the riding track goes right past where Jane's body was found. The gate from my property to the bushland is down the back." She gestured in the general direction. "Only she didn't take Buttercup. The strangest thing happened. I told the police all about it." She stopped talking and stared at her new horse with admiration. "What did you tell the police?" I prompted her. Margaret spun around. Yes, well, it was quite strange. I didn't expect Jane to turn up, what with the dreadful weather and all, but she did. I told her where Buttercup's stable was, and Buttercup's saddle and bridle are always kept directly outside her stable door. Anyway, after I got my new horse settled in, I went down to the stables, and Buttercup's saddle and bridle were missing. "I'm not sure I'm following you," I said, thoroughly perplexed. "That's just it. Buttercup was in another stable, one of the spare stables, and her saddle and bridle were missing." "Did Jane get mixed up and take out another horse?" Margaret shook her head. "No, that's what I thought at first, as Jane had never ridden her before, but Buttercup's stable door is clearly marked with her name. No, this is the strange thing. All the horses are here. Buttercup was in the wrong stable, and Buttercup's saddle and bridle are missing. The saddle and bridle are nowhere to be found. I told the police all this." I scratched my head. "Somebody didn't put them somewhere else by mistake?" "No, because I saw them this morning when I fared up early, so I know for a fact they were there then." "You don't think Jane stole them?" Margaret shrugged. "No, because I have all that expensive show gear in the tack room that she or any other thief could have taken. It's all there. It's awfully strange, isn't it?" I had to admit that it was. Chapter 5. "I was just about to call you," Harriet said by way of greeting. "There was a terrible clap of thunder, and Billy the Kid jumped over his fence." "You're kidding." "He was hot stuff back in his day." Harriet liked to tell me every time I complained about Billy jumping out. "You can't expect him just to stop being hot stuff now." "Does saying hot stuff age us?" I'd always reply. We usually had these conversations while washing the dishes. Harriet would just roll her eyes or swat me with a tea towel. We loved talking about age. Well, I loved talking about age. I loved complaining about how people thought the moment you turned 30, you took one step into the grave. 30. I remember being 30. I remember feeling that young because I'd never stopped feeling that young. Society was so strange when it came to age. Really, I wasn't much older than Jennifer Lopez, give or take 10 years or so, and the world acted like anyone over 50 needed to be locked up in a retirement home. I pulled on my boots and my coat, and I tried to avoid myself in the hallway mirror. I was unsuccessful, however, and ended up staring at myself, my limp hair, the smudges of mascara under my eyes. I don't know why I cared about my appearance. It's not like Prince Charming was going to come riding up on a white stallion. "I'll be back with Billy the Kid soon," I called over my shoulder. I didn't want to go out into the driving rain once more. I wanted a hot meal. I wanted to eat a hot breakfast in bed just one morning. Just one morning I didn't want to jump out of bed to feed all the horses, whom I loved with all my heart, but who took it as a personal offense if I was 10 seconds late with their food. I pulled on the hood of my raincoat as I stepped out into the rain. I could drive my car, search the roads for Billy, but I knew it was easier to cut across the muddy paddocks. A lot quicker, too. Sure, I'd get soaked to the bone, but something drove me out into the pelting rain, a feeling that I needed Billy to know he was loved even when he wasn't making people money. Honestly, I didn't know why people needed animals to serve some sort of a function. Why couldn't an animal just exist? Why did they need to be of service to humans? Why couldn't horses just run wild and free, untamed, manes flickering in the breeze, the sun warm on their rumps? Something darted in front of me, almost tripping me over. I thought it was a rabbit, but when I stood up, a strange cat was staring at me. The cat appeared impossibly old and angry, and its short, unruly fur looked as though it had been chewed by rats. I bent over to peer at the cat. "Are you lost?" I asked him, but a hiss was the only response. The cat ran into the bushes. "Billy!" I called when the cat disappeared. Billy was at Starburst's fence, running his whiskers along the wire, trying to see if the electric tape was live. Really, that horse was far too smart for his own good. I had to thank my lucky stars he'd chosen to visit Starburst and not Fancy, as Fancy was on the other side of town. Billy snorted, annoyed, as if I was somehow the one being naughty. "Honestly, Billy," I said, "I'm beginning to think you're not afraid of storms at all. You just want to pretend so you can trot off to visit your girlfriends." Billy rolled his eyes and snorted again. "Don't use that language, young man." I put the halter on him. Billy and I walked back across the paddock in the direction of the rescue facility. The rain was easing as I led him along a quiet road, and soon it stopped entirely. I was talking to Billy about the lunch I wanted to eat when a black Mustang pulled over and that insufferable detective stepped onto the road. "Miss Cally Colt," Detective Rick Bronco said. He made it sound like an accusation. Up close, he smelt uncomfortably good. He smelt like rain and woodsy soap and something peppery I could not name. "Cally," I replied. "Please." He raised an eyebrow. "Please what?" "I mean you can call me Cally." "A strange name." "Excuse me?" Detective Bronco looked at Billy, and then he looked back at me. "Don't you have fences, Cally?" I fought the urge to scream. "Yes, of course I have fences, Rick." "You can call me Detective Bronco," he replied. "You shouldn't let him wander the streets." "I don't let Billy wander the streets, Detective Bronco," I snapped. "He escaped. He doesn't like storms, and he, My voice trailed away. Detective Bronco scowled. "Yes?" "Billy has girlfriends. They used to be at the rescue, and he was attached to them. I rehomed them, but he misses them. Horses get attached to their friends, you see. Billy likes to escape to visit his girlfriends." "He sounds like my dad," Detective Bronco said. A slow red flush covered his face. "I mean, what I meant to say was, Miss Colt, why are you prying into my personal life?" "I am not prying into your personal life. I'm trying to get Billy the Kid home safely." "Allow me to walk you home." "Why?" "It's safer if I do." Detective Bronco did walk us home. I knew he was trying to get information out of me about the murder, but I did not have any information to give. I counted down the steps until I got home and could ditch him. But tragically, Becky ran up to the gates when we finally did arrive. "Hot guy your age alert," Becky whispered to me altogether too loudly. Then, to Detective Bronco, she said, "Would you like to stay for lunch?" "No," I said, at the exact same time as Detective Bronco said, "Yes." "Go inside, both of you," Becky ordered, bossy as usual. She took Billy's halter. "I'll join you after I put Billy in the stable for a while. Was he visiting Fancy this time?" I shook my head. "Starburst." "Why don't you keep him in a stable all the time?" the detective asked me. "That would be the sensible thing to do, given that he keeps escaping." "Billy gets anxious if he's in a stable for more than a few hours at a time," I said with a sigh. I was going to mention wind-sucking and weaving, but I didn't know how much the detective knew about horses. I'll have to raise funding for higher fences for his paddock. Soon, Detective Bronco and I found ourselves sitting at the table with Harriet. "We haven't had a man in the house for ages," Harriet said. "I mean, apart from when you and your partner questioned us in the line of duty." "Becky did sneak Billy the Kid into the kitchen last week for an Instagram photo," I said. "Billy is male." Harriet nodded. "Horses are less work than men. Much cleaner, too. Anyway, I'll make us all some bagels with Vegemite." I was nervous about having Detective Bronco in the house. I rapidly ate my bagel and hoped he would eat his just as quickly. I was not disappointed. "Thank you for the invite, Becky," Detective Bronco said as soon as he had eaten the last crumb. "Miss Colt, don't leave town." "Oh, so I have to cancel my vacation to the Maldives, do I? What a shame. I was so looking forward to getting drunk and partying with 21-year-olds. I tried to sound sincere, but even I was startled by how sarcastic I actually sounded. "Ha, you're too old to party," Becky said. I pulled a face, but to be honest, I did feel too old to party. I tried to remember the days my friends and I would stay out all night, our toes bruised and blistered from our high heels, our ankles hurting. No, give me a good book and a nice warm bed any time. "Touchy subject," Detective Bronco said with a smirk, and I wondered why nobody had thought to murder him yet. Surely he had a bitter ex-wife with enough money to take out a hit. Chapter 6. After Detective Bronco left, I had to run downtown to buy food. Human food this time. The horses always were provided for first, and I often forgot that humans needed food too. The poor lunch offering of bagels with Vegemite had prompted my shopping expedition. When I got home, laden with delicious cinnamon buns, triple chocolate cupcakes, lemon meringue pies, lamingtons and custard tarts, along with other essentials, Monica hurried to meet me. She waved one perfectly manicured finger at me. I wondered how Monica always looked perfect, when I invariably had bits of hay in my hair and constantly smelled of horses. "We have a stray cat?" "A what?" I shrieked. "A stray cat. There he is now." I followed her gaze and was surprised to see the scruffy cat sitting on a bale of hay. He opened his mouth to hiss, revealing a set of long, yellow teeth. "I just saw that cat. He darted out in front of me when I was getting Billy the Kid." Monica frowned. "He can't be the same cat. The vet has already checked him to see if he's microchipped. He isn't, so I thought he could live here, unless you object. Horses and cats are always good friends." I shook my head. "I don't object, but I can't see how that cat got here so fast." "Maybe it's a different cat." I stared at the cat. "There can't possibly be two cats in the world that look like that." Monica agreed. "He does look unusual. Quite angry, really. The vet said he's as old as the hills. Anyway, the new mare has just arrived, and I called the vet to her." "Is she okay?" "Nasty swelling on her off foreleg, halfway up her cannon. The skin was broken, but the cut wasn't deep. She's on antibiotics now." I hurried after Monica to see the new horse. She was even skinnier than I had imagined. "Don't worry, we'll have her looking marvelous in no time," Monica reassured me. "I started her on probiotics." "There's no point to that, because the antibiotics will kill the probiotics," I told her. "Don't give her any more probiotics until she's finished the course of antibiotics." Monica slapped her palm on her forehead. "I forgot about that." I stroked the mare's velvety nose. She nickered softly to me. "She's a real sweetie." "And she thinks she's in heaven having this nice hay and being out of the rain in this lovely deep straw bedding." I agreed. It was nice of Audrey to bring her here. "So long as she doesn't bring us any more horses, we're full up now." I snorted. "We were full up before." I sighed, long and hard. "Anyway, let's post photos of her on social media and ask for donations. Maybe somebody will sponsor her. The expenses are through the roof." We walked out of her stall and shut the door behind us. "Did you find out anything from Margaret?" Monica asked me. "I sure did." I filled Monica in on the details. "And I found out something too." Monica looked quite pleased with herself. "You know how I have facial treatments at that salon?" I nodded. She pushed on. I thought I'd heard Jane Fairweather's name before, but I couldn't place it. It kept niggling at me, and then I remembered I had spoken to her in the waiting room there one day. That got my interest. And it was definitely her? Monica nodded slowly. It sure was. We spoke about horses, and I've become friends with the receptionist, possibly because I go there so often. While I was waiting for the vet, I called her and asked her if she knew anything about Jane Fairweather. Let me guess, I said. She did. Monica nodded enthusiastically. She sure did, and she gave me some juicy gossip. She told me that Jane was having an affair with Margaret's husband, Guy. That left me speechless. I sat on the nearest bale of straw bedding. You're kidding? No, that's what she said. I wonder if Margaret knows. Yes, of course she does, as that's how the receptionist found out, Monica said. Margaret goes there for treatments, and she was the one who told her. It was straight from the horse's mouth. No pun intended. I rubbed my forehead hard and tried to process the information. So Margaret suspected Jane Fairweather was having an affair with Guy. Exactly. Cally, do you think Margaret could have murdered Jane? Would Margaret have it in her to murder somebody? This was all too much for me. I shrugged. I have no idea, but somebody murdered Jane, and the only suspects I have are Margaret, plus Harriet's ex-husband, Joel. Maybe Joel found out that Jane was two-timing him. Margaret's property backs onto the bushland where Jane's body was found, Monica pointed out. That makes me less inclined to think she's the murderer. Monica appeared puzzled. Why do you say that? Because it would look too suspicious. Surely, if Margaret was going to murder Jane Fairweather, she wouldn't have murdered her so close to her own property. Besides, there's this matter of the missing saddle and bridle. Monica tapped her chin. Yes, if Margaret murdered Jane, why would she claim that the saddle and bridle are missing? Exactly. I think I need to speak with Harriet's husband. Chapter 7. I wasn't looking forward to interrogating Harriet's husband. I had always found him to be an affable man, although football-obsessed, but he also owned a local produce store and supplied all the horse food for the rescue, and at a good discount at that. I couldn't see that Joel would be a murderer, but then again, I wouldn't know a murderer if I fell over one. When I had seen images of murderers on TV, they all looked like completely normal people to me. I headed to the produce store under the pretense of buying more horse food. Of course, a horse rescue charity always needed more horse food. I drove through into the huge steel barn and jumped out of the car. One of the assistants hurried over to me. Before he could say a word, I asked, "Is Joel here?" The man laughed. "Are you kidding, Cally? He's all excited about going to the game tonight. He's taken the day off." I rubbed my forehead hard. I was a little sick on the stomach and wondered if I had a migraine coming on. "Where's the game held tonight?" "The Gabba," he said. "It's a Brisbane Lions home game, and they were beaten last week. As it's the start of the season, he's very excited." He rolled his eyes. That's all he ever thinks about. I looked past him into the office. Framed, signed Guernseys covered every inch of space, and football scarves hung from the walls. I liked football, but not that much. I realized the man was still speaking. "Do you want me to pass on a message?" I shook my head. "No, that's okay, it's nothing." I bought the feed and then drove home slowly, wondering how I could get tickets to the game. They usually sold out pretty fast. When I got home, I charged into my office, nearly knocking Harriet out of the way. "Has something happened?" she asked, her face white and drawn. "Your husband? What's he done now? Have the police arrested him for the murder?" I shook my head. "No, but I went to the feed store to question him, and he's taken the day off because there's a game tonight." Harriet let out a long string of rude words. "Excuse my language, but that didn't help our marriage." "What didn't?" I asked over my shoulder as I headed for my computer. Football, of course. That's all he can ever talk about. I thought I liked football, but he's completely fanatical. What are you going to do? Speak to him tomorrow? No, that detective could come along and charge me with murder at any minute. Harriet appeared alarmed. They need evidence, Cally. Even if he suspects you and is fairly certain you did it, he still needs evidence. I shook my finger at her. You know as well as I do that innocent people have been sent to prison. I'm not risking it. I'm going to try to get tickets tonight. Harriet looked over my shoulder. No, you can't just buy any old tickets. He'll be in these posh seats here. She jabbed her finger on the online map of the Gabba, the football stadium. He does pay for his own seat, but I know there's something on tonight. He'll be going to Gabba grounds. What's that? I only ever bought the cheapest seats. I'll show you. Harriet tapped away at her phone and then thrust it under my nose. Here's the Instagram hashtag. This is where he'll be. They serve cocktails and everyone dresses up. Okay, I'll see if I can get tickets for that. Get 2 tickets. I'll come with you. I spun around in my chair. You can't, Harriet. What will you and your husband do if you see each other? I'll ask Monica if she can come with me. I might not even be able to get tickets anyway. With Harriet still muttering about how she wanted to come, I managed to buy 2 tickets. And so, many hours later, and after a drive up the M1 and M3 through heavy rain, I found myself in an expensive parking area which was about 1 kilometre from the Gabba. Normally I would have walked, but due to the rain I caught an Uber. Monica had agreed to come with me, much to my relief. She was dressed to the nines in an amazing pink dress, showing plenty of leg, and high heels. Her makeup was impeccable, and her hot pink designer handbag hung elegantly over one shoulder. I, on the other hand, didn't look anywhere near as good. The Uber deposited us directly outside the correct entry gate. The rain had stopped by now, and we stood at the end of the short line. Everybody was elegantly dressed. When I reached security, a guard asked, "What's that green stuff in your hair?" I was horribly embarrassed. "It's hay," I said, furiously brushing it out. Monica groaned and flattened my hair. "Honestly, Cally, and look, one of the false eyelashes I painstakingly put on you fell off when you did that. We will have to go to the bathroom right away so I can put it back on." It didn't take long for Monica to attach the wayward eyelash, and then we made our way to the room. Someone called out my name, and I looked up to see Joel beaming and bearing down upon us. "I haven't seen you at the football before, Cally. And you too, Monica. Go Lions." "Go Lions," I said. "Joel, it's good to see you. Monica brought me tonight to cheer me up because the police suspect me of murdering Jane Fairweather." Joel's jaw fell open. "Surely not." "Cally was the one who found the body," Monica told him. "Yes, it's all over town." "Have the police questioned you too?" I asked him. Joel's face flushed an ugly shade of red. "Yes, all because that—" He hesitated and then added, "Harriet told them I was having an affair with Jane Fairweather." "You weren't?" "Of course not. I knew Jane, of course. She used to come into the feed store." I was at once suspicious. "But why did she? She didn't own a horse?" Joel glanced around him before leaning forward and saying in little more than a whisper, "She came to my feed store so we could discuss football." I didn't know what to say, but thankfully Monica did. "We heard that Jane and Guy were having an affair." Joel held up both hands, palms outwards. "Really? Are you sure?" He looked none too pleased. "Well, I have no idea what gave Harriet the idea that I was having an affair with Jane. We were only talking about football." He shook his head. Monica and I exchanged glances. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" I asked Monica as soon as Joel was out of earshot. "Not if he's the murderer, of course, Cally. Honestly, you can be so naive at times. If he is the murderer, then of course he would lie. It only stands to reason, and even if he isn't the murderer, he's hardly likely to admit to an affair. I suppose so. Monica grabbed my arm and dragged me over to a huge pink couch. She handed me her phone. Take some photos for my Instagram and make sure they're good ones. I had only taken 5 or so photos when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around. There, standing behind me, was Detective Rick Bronco, wearing a tight suit and a deep frown. "Cally Colt, we need to talk," he said. Chapter 8. I followed Detective Bronco into one of the corporate rooms. I had always wanted to be in a corporate room, but certainly not in these circumstances. He indicated that I sit. I did so, and he sat opposite me. The detective placed his arms on the table and leant forward. "Let's abandon all pretense, shall we? You know the truth, and I know the truth, so there's no further need for these games." "I think I need a lawyer." He appeared exasperated. "More game playing? What on earth do you mean?" He shot me a long, cold look. "Your family was of the famous Colt bloodline. You like football, and you like horses. It's extremely obvious." I glared at him. "It certainly isn't obvious to me." My tone was waspish, and I wasn't the least bit sorry. Detective Bronco sighed. "I'm sure you know as well as I do that Kelpies like football and horses." I was at a loss. "Are you saying I'm a dog? I mean, I like dogs, but isn't that an insult?" He rubbed his forehead in an obvious gesture of frustration. "Your family were all Kelpies." I realized I hadn't heard him correctly. "I'm sorry, what did you say? What were my family? I thought you said they were Kelpies." "Come on, Miss Colt. Look, a woman has been murdered. We both know what's going on here. Drop the pretense. Stop pretending you don't know what a Kelpie is." I was indignant. "Of course I know what a Kelpie is. Doesn't everybody? Kelpies are Australia's most famous working breed of dog. I have no idea what you're talking about." A slow red flush travelled up the detective's face. His black eyes grew even darker, and for a moment I fancied they glowed. "Either you're a very good actress or you're—" He appeared to be searching for the right word. I imagined it was stupid. "If this is some kind of prank, it's in very poor taste," I scolded him. "Is it possible you don't know?" "Don't know what?" I countered. "About Kelpies." I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up one hand to forestall me. "Not the Australian working dog. I'm talking about the Kelpies of Scottish legend." I rubbed my temples. I nearly wiped my eyes, but realized that wouldn't do the false eyelashes any good. "Yes, of course I know about those legendary creatures," I said, wondering what that had to do with anything. "They shapeshift between horses and humans. They lure people onto their backs and then go into a river and drown them." The detective leant forward once more. "And that is precisely what happened to Jane Fairweather." I was aware my mouth had fallen open in shock. The game had started, and the crowd sent up a roar as a goal was scored in the opening minute of the game. Yet my attention was firmly focused on the detective. Had he completely lost his marbles? "But there's no such thing," I protested weakly. The detective appeared to be thinking matters over. It seemed to be an age before he spoke. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I can assure you, Ms. Colt, that Kelpies most certainly do exist. I have made it my life's work to investigate murders by Kelpies. And your parents have told you nothing of this?" "Of course not," I snapped. "Are you mad? Kelpies don't exist. Besides, my parents died when I was quite young." He nodded slowly. "But they had horses." It was a statement, not a question. Nevertheless, I nodded. "Wait, are you saying my parents were Kelpies? That they turned into horses, lured people into riding them, and took them into rivers and drowned them?" I realized my voice had risen to a high pitch, but nobody else could hear me. He shook his head slowly. No, I have heard no such thing about your parents. Not all Kelpies are murderers. However, there is a large criminal element amongst the Kelpie population. Then you're not saying my parents were Kelpies? My head was spinning. Yes, they were Kelpies. They were not murderers, at least not as far as I know. A horrible thought struck me. Had my parents shapeshifted into horses? I thought of the horses we had at home when I was a child. Were those horses actually my parents? My hands flew to my throat. I gasped for air. Relief flooded me when I remembered I had seen the horses and my parents together at the same time. But why was I buying into this man's story? It was ridiculous, unbelievable. It couldn't be true. I realized I must have said it aloud. Rick Bronco stood. It is most certainly true, although I realize it must come as a shock. You, Miss Colt, are also a Kelpie. It's impossible for you to be otherwise, given that both your parents were Kelpies. Are you mad? I said again. You're saying I turn into a horse? I think I'd notice if I did. He shot me a long, appraising look. Maybe you don't know. He stared for a longer interval before adding, that would explain it. Are you a vegetarian? Do you like oats, carrots, and barley grass juice? Do you sleepwalk? That's an indication. If your mind can't accept that you're a Kelpie, you would only shift at night and not remember it. I jumped to my feet, flipped my long hair over my shoulder, and stomped my foot. I'm not a horse, I yelled, before considering that maybe stomping my foot wasn't such a good idea, given that irritated horses do that. I sat back down. I'm not accusing you of murdering anybody, Ms. Colt. You need time to process this. You think? He ignored me. I will ask you to keep this conversation to yourself, but if you do mention it to anyone else, I will deny it. Nobody would believe me anyway. I stared at him. He seemed to believe what he was saying. But aren't Kelpies creatures of Scottish legend? They're not Australian. How did they get here? His expression remained impassive. They got here the same way as rabbits, foxes, and cane toads, on a boat, or in more recent times, on a plane. Kelpies are humans, Ms. Colt. They shift into horses, that's all. I jumped to my feet. That's all? Can you hear yourself? This is crazy. And are you trying to tell me that a Kelpie drowned Jane Fairweather? Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And whether you believe me or not, one thing is clear. The Kelpie who drowned Jane Fairweather is close to you. Very close indeed. Chapter 9. It was a long drive home through the rain. I hadn't managed to enjoy the game, not one bit. All I could think about was that Detective Rick Bronco had said I was a Kelpie. As ridiculous as it was, I couldn't help but wonder. I did have sleepwalking episodes. I always ended up in one of the horse stalls on a bed of straw. My head was spinning, and I had a crashing headache. And as if that wasn't enough to worry about, the detective had all but said there was a murderer close by. As Monica happily chatted away, I zoned out and tried to think. Joel certainly had the motive. If he had discovered his girlfriend was also having an affair with Guy, then that might have pushed him over the edge. Then again, Guy was also a suspect because he had likely discovered his mistress was having an affair with Joel. Margaret, too, was a suspect because she had discovered her husband was having an affair with the victim. One thing, however, was troubling me. If Margaret had murdered Jane Fairweather, then why did she claim that Buttercup's saddle and bridle were missing? And when Margaret had sent Jane to ride Buttercup, why wasn't Buttercup in her stable? Something hovered at the back of my mind, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I felt as though the answer was only just eluding me. Surely, if I put a little more effort into it, it would come to me. But try as I might, it didn't. And I couldn't believe that I was a Kelpie. But if I were to entertain the thought, then surely Joel was one too. He liked horses and he liked football. I'd had dinner with Joel and Harriet many times over the years, and I knew he was a vegetarian. After I dropped Monica back at her house, I hurried home. I shut the front gate, glancing around to make sure Greta Garbo hadn't escaped, and then drove to the house. Another uneasy feeling hit me, but Billy the Kid was in his paddock. He looked over the fence and whinnied to me. I wasted no time unlocking the door and letting myself into the house. Harriet was in the kitchen. "Oh, I thought you'd be asleep," I said. "I was being quiet, trying not to wake you." Harriet threw up her hands in a gesture of frustration. "Wake me? I haven't had a wink of sleep. Tell me everything that happened. Do you think my husband is the murderer?" I shrugged. "Well, he does like horses and football, and he's a vegetarian," I said. Harriet narrowed her eyes. "Whatever do you mean?" I rubbed my eyes hard and then put my hands down. I let out a little squeal when I saw two big hairy grubs sitting in front of me. I brushed the grubs away before I realized they were false eyelashes. I had the weirdest, most unbelievable conversation with that detective, and you'll never believe what he said. I need a drink. "Pims? Wine? Gin?" "Yes." Harriet crossed her arms over her chest. "Choose just one, Cally," she said sternly. "You can't have all three." "Pims, please, and pour yourself one. You're not going to believe what I have to tell you." "Wait, that detective was at the game?" I nodded slowly. Harriet poured me a glass of Pims, and I took a large gulp before telling her everything the detective had said. "Do you think he's certifiably insane?" I concluded. I looked up and saw Harriet biting her lip. "I don't know how to tell you this, Cally, but everything he told you was true." A wave of cold disbelief hit me. I drained the rest of my Pims in one gulp. "He's not really your cousin or something, and the two of you are playing a terrible prank on me." Harriet shook her head vigorously. "Cally, we've been friends for years. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought your parents would have told you, but I wasn't sure, and when you never mentioned it, I didn't either." The room started to spin. I looked at Harriet, but she seemed a long way away. I hoped I wasn't going into shock. But, what?" I stammered. "It's not true. It can't be true." "It is true. You're a Kelpie, and Joel and I are Kelpies. I was worried, as lately you've been having more of what you think are sleepwalking episodes. Why, only last week I saw you in horse form going down those steep stairs." She gestured over her shoulder. "I was terribly worried you'd do yourself an injury. I've been wondering how to broach the subject with you. Please forgive me for not telling you sooner." I clutched my head with both hands. "It can't be true. It can't be true," I said over and over again. "There's no such thing." To my abject horror, Harriet threw off her clothes. She transformed herself into a horse right before my very eyes. She was a bay horse with a blaze and 2 front white stockings. I screamed and backed away. Seconds later, she transformed back into a person. "It's not possible," I squeaked. "How can there be such things?" "The indigenous people speak of bunyips," Harriet said in soothing tones as she put her clothes back on, "and also of the red ochre men and the yowies. They are not supposed to exist, but plenty of people claim they've seen them. Are all these people delusional? Of course not. And plenty of people have seen the big black panthers in Australia too, but most people say they don't exist." I was doing my best to come to grips with the situation. "Are you saying I'm a Kelpie?" Harriet nodded. "Yes. Try to set aside your disbelief and just accept who you are. It will be much safer for you. Now, tell me what that detective said." "I've already told you," I protested. She shook her head. "No, I mean, does he still suspect you? Or does he suspect Joel? And why is that cat living here now? Whose idea was that? The cat? The abrupt change of subject puzzled me. I turned to look at him. He was sitting by the door, staring at me. What does the cat have to do with anything? He turned up here, and Monica asked if he could stay. Harriet's eyes narrowed. You haven't answered me. Does that detective suspect you? I thought it over for a moment. I don't think he suspects me. Maybe he does suspect Joel. He said the murderer was close to me. That detective isn't to be trusted, Harriet said. I've heard about him. He's quite famous. Really? I've never heard of him. Harriet rolled her eyes. He's famous in Kelpie circles. He investigates incidents of drownings by Kelpies. He's a fanatic. It's hard to believe all this. Still, it did seem to be true, but I was having considerable trouble accepting it. Do you think Joel murdered Jane Fairweather? Harriet nodded. Sad to say, I do. Isn't it obvious? I thought it over. He was having an affair with the victim, and you yourself said he was a Kelpie. Now I know what to look for. He likes football, he's a vegetarian, and he likes horses. Of course you're a Kelpie too. An uneasy thought struck me. Harriet also was a suspect. Her husband had been having an affair with Jane Fairweather. She had the motive, and she was a Kelpie. Something occurred to me. The morning after I found the body, Harriet's hair had been soaking wet, yet she had no reason to have been outside. She never did anything with the horses. I assumed she'd had a shower, but the plumber hadn't fixed the water at that stage. How had I forgotten? Had Harriet murdered Jane Fairweather? She had the motive, and she was soaking wet just after the murder had been committed. I now understood the missing saddle and bridle, and why Buttercup hadn't been in her stable. Harriet had swapped herself for Buttercup. Jane, seeing the nameplate over Buttercup's stable, had put the saddle and bridle on Harriet and had ridden her down by the river. I shuddered. Don't look at me like that, Cally. Now that you know I'm a Kelpie too, are you wondering if I murdered Jane Fairweather? I thought about denying it, but thought I might as well tell the truth. After all, Harriet and I had been friends from childhood. Jane was having an affair with your husband, but why would you murder her and not your husband? To my surprise, Harriet answered, Joel's a Kelpie. A Kelpie can't murder another Kelpie by luring them into a river and drowning them. Besides, it wasn't Joel's fault. That woman threw herself at him, just like I expect she did with Margaret's husband, Guy. Why would she want two men? A loud clap of thunder punctuated her remark, and I heard the sound of another tree branch hitting the ground. I hoped it hadn't fallen on a fence, but that was the least of my worries at the moment. Harriet, tell me you didn't murder Jane Fairweather. Harriet's face had changed. I had never seen her look like this before. She deserved it. Why would she break up a happy marriage? She called Jane a string of names that made my mouth fall open. I couldn't believe it. Harriet, my childhood friend, was a murderer. I shook myself and realized Harriet was still speaking. I was lurking around, listening to their conversation. I was wondering how to get Jane by herself. I couldn't believe my luck when that new horse arrived, and Margaret told Jane to take Buttercup out for a ride. I ran as fast as I could down to the stables. I put Buttercup in another stable, and then I put myself in her stable. Jane put the saddle and bridle on me and took me for a ride. From there, it was easy to drown her. Then I simply turned back into a person. Yes, I'd figured that out, I said. I wondered what Harriet was going to do next, when she grabbed a large kitchen knife and lunged at me. Run, said a voice, but there was nobody there, only the cat. I flung open the side door of the kitchen and sprinted out into the rain, with Harriet clutching the knife hard on my heels. The knife never reached me. A horse barreled into Harriet and knocked her over. Chapter 10. Are you sure you don't need to see a doctor? Detective Smith asked me. I mean, elderly people like you are more prone to injury. You can't take any chances at your age. You know, as we age, we're more prone to shock, and you've certainly had a terrible fright." "I'm fine," I snapped. "Is that all?" The detective shot me a look of concern. "I'm sure you'll want a rest. It would be a nasty shock for somebody my age, and you're, well, much older." I wanted to throw something at him. Thankfully, he took his leave. "I can't believe Harriet was the murderer." Monica patted my hand. "I've known her for years." "People have secrets," I said, in what was a massive understatement. Becky piped up. "I don't like that detective. And why does he always yell at you, Cally?" "I expect he thinks everybody my age is deaf." "Where's the handsome detective?" Monica asked me. I shrugged. "I have no idea. Anyway, when I called him and he didn't answer, the call got put through to Detective Smith. By the time he arrived, Harriet was regaining consciousness and babbling away. She confessed everything. Except for the part about being a Kelpie," I silently added. "I can't imagine Harriet murdering her husband's mistress," Monica said. "It's hard to take in. But I'm more surprised she tried to murder you, her friend. Still, she always did seem jealous of you." I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue. Becky put her arm around my shoulders. "Don't worry, Cally. You have me and Monica. We love you, and so do all the horses." I shot her a smile. "Thanks, Becky. I appreciate the support. And speaking of horses, did you put a notice on Facebook about the horse we found?" Monica nodded. "Yes, but it's the middle of the night, so I doubt the owner has noticed he's missing yet." I nodded. "When Harriet got knocked over, I assumed Greta Garbo had escaped again and was sitting on her. Imagine my shock when it was a completely different horse." "He obviously jumped a fence in fright during the thunderstorm," Becky said. "You did a good job of bandaging his leg." "And I gave him tetanus shots as well as a sedative," I said. "He was certainly hard to calm down, and it's bad enough Harriet trying to stab me, but stabbing a horse—" Monica shook her head. "To be fair, Harriet would never harm a horse. She must have accidentally stabbed that horse when he knocked her over." I agreed. "That's true. Well, you two had better go home and get some sleep. Thanks so much for coming over so late at night." Becky gave me another hug. "We're your friends, Cally. We're always here for you. All's well that ends well. You're safe." Monica joined in the hug, and then they left. I was still trying to process everything that had happened. Harriet was a murderer. I was a Kelpie. Could things get any stranger? To maintain some normalcy, I thought I should check on the new arrival, the lost horse Harriet had accidentally stabbed. The rain had stopped, but I pulled my thick coat over my shoulders, grabbed a torch, and walked out to the barn. I turned on the barn lights. The horses whinnied to me, expecting to be fed. In fact, every time they saw me, they expected to be fed. They were like cats in that way, I supposed. And talking of cats, the cat was sitting outside the end stall, looking for all the world like an Egyptian statue, almost as though he was guarding the door. I shook my head at the fanciful notion and walked to the end stall to check on the black horse. I gasped. There, lying in the straw, was Detective Rick Bronco. He was naked, and his arm was bandaged. The end. This was the novella prequel to the Colt Calling Horse Rescue Mysteries series. All the other books in the series are full-length novels. If you want to find out what happens with Cally, Detective Bronco, and the mysterious cat, the next book in the series is Book 1, Saddled with Murder. Cally Colt has discovered the overbearing Detective Rick Bronco's secret, but a terrible tale of woe is developing at the horse rescue. One of the new volunteers has been murdered. With the detective being his customary self, and the stray cat having a surprising secret of his own, Cally is left to investigate. Will she put the cart before the horse, or will she pony up and solve the murder? You've just listened to 60, Sassy and Sleuthing, Colt Calling Rescue Horse Mysteries Series Prequel, written by Morgana Best, narrated by Amy Soakes. Copyright 2021 by Morgana Best. Production copyright 2022 by Morgana Best. If you've enjoyed this audiobook, please consider leaving a review and recommending on social media or directly to friends and family. And keep an eye out for other audiobooks by Morgana Best. Thanks for listening.